Horrid Henry and the Secret Club. Halt! Who goes there? Me. Who's me? Said moody Margaret. Me, said sour Susan. What's the password? Sour Susan paused. What was the password? She thought and thought and thought. Potatoes? Margaret sighed loudly. Why was she friends with such a stupid person? No, it isn't. Yes, it is, said Susan. Potatoes was last week's password, said Margaret. No, it wasn't. Yes, it was, said moody Margaret. It's my club, and I decide. There was a long pause. All right, said Susan sourly. What is the password? I don't know if I'm going to tell you, said Margaret. I could be giving away a big secret to the enemy. But I'm not the enemy, said Susan. I'm Susan. Shh, said Margaret. We don't want Henry to find out who's in the secret club. Susan looked quickly over her shoulder. The enemy was nowhere to be seen. She whistled twice. All clear, said sour Susan. Now let me in. Moody Margaret thought for a moment. Letting someone in without the password broke the first club rule. Prove to me you're Susan, and not the enemy pretending to be Susan, said Margaret. You know it's me, wailed Susan. Prove it. Susan stuck her foot into the tent. I'm wearing the black patent leather shoes with the blue flowers I always wear. No good, said Margaret. The enemy could have stolen them. I'm speaking with Susan's voice, and I look like Susan, said Susan. No good, said Margaret. The enemy could be a master of disguise. Susan stamped her foot. And I know that you were the one who pinched Helen, and I'm going to tell Miss— Come closer to the tent flap, said Margaret. Susan bent over. Now listen to me, said Margaret, because I'm only going to tell you once. When a secret club member wants to come in, they say, Nunga. Anyone inside answers back, Nunga no. That's how I know it's you, and you know it's me. Nunga, said sour Susan. Nunga no, said moody Margaret. Enter. Susan entered the club. She gave the secret handshake, sat down on her box, and sulked. You knew it was me all along, said Susan. Margaret scowled at her. That's not the point. If you don't want to obey the club rules, you can leave. Susan didn't move. Can I have a biscuit? She said. Margaret smiled graciously. Have two, she said. Then we'll get down to business. Meanwhile, hidden under a bush behind some strategically placed branches, another top-secret meeting was taking place in the next-door garden. I think that's everything, said the leader. I shall now put the plans into action. What am I going to do? Said Perfect Peter. Stand guard, said Horrid Henry. I always have to stand guard, said Peter, as the leader crept out. It's not fair. Have you brought your spy report? Asked Margaret. Yes, said Susan. Read it aloud, said Margaret. Susan took out a piece of paper and read, I watched the enemy's house for 2 hours yesterday morning. Which morning? Interrupted Margaret. Saturday morning, said Susan. A lady with grey hair and a beret walked past. What colour was the beret? Said Margaret. I don't know, said Susan. Call yourself a spy and you don't know what colour the beret was, said Margaret. Can I please continue with my report, said Susan. I'm not stopping you, said Margaret. Then I saw the enemy leave the house with his brother and mother. The enemy kicked his brother twice. His mother shouted at him. Then I saw the postman. Nunga! Screeched a voice from outside. Margaret and Susan froze. Nunga! Screeched the voice again. I know you're in there. Ah! Squeaked Susan. It's Henry! Quick, hide! Hissed Margaret. The secret spies crouched behind 2 boxes. You told him our password, hissed Margaret. How dare you? Wasn't me, hissed Susan. I couldn't even remember it, so how could I have told him? You told him. Didn't, hissed Margaret. Nunga! Screeched Henry again. You have to let me in. I know the password. What do we do? Hissed Susan. You said anyone who knows the password enters. For the last time, Nunga! Shouted Horrid Henry. Nunga-noo, said Margaret. Enter. Henry swaggered into the tent. Margaret glared at him. Don't mind if I do, said Henry, grabbing all the chocolate biscuits and stuffing them into his mouth. Then he sprawled on the rug, scattering crumbs everywhere. What are you doing? Said Horrid Henry. Nothing, said moody Margaret. Nothing, said sour Susan. You are too, said Henry. Mind your own business, said Margaret. Now, Susan, let's vote on whether to allow boys in. I vote no. I vote no too, said Susan. Sorry, Henry, you can't join. Now, leave. No, said Henry. Leave, said Margaret. Make me, said Henry. Margaret took a deep breath, then she opened her mouth and screamed. No one could scream as loud or as long or as piercingly as moody Margaret. After a few moments, Susan started screaming too. Henry got to his feet, knocking over the crate they used as a table. Watch out, said Henry, because the purple hand will be back. He turned to go. Moody Margaret sprang up behind him and pushed him through the flap. Henry landed in a heap outside. Can't get me! Shouted Henry. He picked himself up and jumped over the wall. The purple hand, he's the best! Oh, yeah, muttered Margaret. We'll see about that. Henry checked over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Then he crept back to his fort. Smelly toads, he whispered to the guard. The branches parted. Henry climbed in. Did you attack them? Said Peter. Of course, said Henry. Didn't you hear Margaret screaming? I was the one who heard their password, so I think I should have gone, said Peter. Whose club is this? Said Henry. The corners of Peter's mouth began to turn down. Right! Out! Said Henry. Sorry, said Peter. Please, Henry, can I be a real member of the Purple Hand? No, said Henry. You're too young. And don't you dare come into the fort when I'm not here. I won't, said Peter. Good, said Henry. Now, here's the plan. I'm going to set a booby trap in Margaret's tent. Then when she goes in... Henry shrieked with laughter as he pictured moody Margaret covered in cold, muddy water. All was not well back at moody Margaret's secret club. It's your fault, said Margaret. It isn't, said Susan. You're such a blabbermouth, and you're a terrible spy. I am not, said Susan. Well, I'm leader, and I ban you from the club for a week for breaking our sacred rule and telling the enemy our password. Now go away. Oh, please let me stay, said Susan. No, said Margaret. Susan knew there was no point arguing with Margaret when she got that horrible bossy look on her face. "You're so mean," said Susan. Moody Margaret picked up a book and started to read. Sour Susan got up and left. "I know what I'll do to fix Henry," thought Margaret. "I'll set a booby trap in Henry's fort. Then, when he goes in—" Margaret shrieked with laughter as she pictured horrid Henry covered in cold, muddy water. Just before lunch, Henry sneaked into Margaret's garden, holding a plastic bucket of water and some string. He stretched the string just above the ground across the entrance and suspended the bucket above with the other end of the string tied round it. Just after lunch, Margaret sneaked into Henry's garden holding a bucket of water and some string. She stretched the string across the fort's entrance and rigged up the bucket. What she wouldn't give to see Henry soaking wet when he tripped over the string and pulled the bucket of water down on him. Perfect Peter came into the garden carrying a ball. Henry wouldn't play with him, and there was nothing to do. "Why shouldn't I go into the fort?" thought Peter. "I helped build it." Next door, Sour Susan slipped into the garden. She was feeling sulky. "Why shouldn't I go into the tent?" thought Susan. "It's my club too." Perfect Peter walked into the fort and tripped. Crash! Splash! Sour Susan walked into the tent and tripped. Crash! Splash! Horrid Henry heard howls. He ran into the garden, whooping, "Ha ha! Margaret! Gotcha!" Then he stopped. Moody Margaret heard screams. She ran into the garden, cheering, "Ha ha! Henry! Gotcha!" Then she stopped. "That's it!" shrieked Peter. "I'm leaving!" "But it wasn't me," said Henry. "That's it!" sobbed Susan. "I quit!" "But it wasn't me," said Margaret. "Rats!" said Henry. "Rats!" said Margaret. They glared at each other.